All right, Alexander, let's talk about Turkey and Syria, Turkey and Iraq, I guess you could say as well. The Kurds, the Kurdish factions that are there, that Turkey is has been going after over the past couple of days, and we have rumors, I think very well grounded rumors, that Turkey is considering a ground offensive against these Kurdish forces in Syria and Iraq. And of course, we've mentioned that these Kurdish factions are are aligned with the United States. They have been acting as a type of proxy of the United States, as well as the U.S. illegally occupying a part of Syria as well. And I was reading articles, and I haven't been able to confirm them, but they are saying that Russia has given Turkey the green light for a ground offensive. I don't know how true that is, but that's one thing that happened over the weekend that I read. I did also read that the U.S. ambassador in Ankara, and I believe it was the U.S. ambassador in Ankara, has been holding talks with Turkish officials trying to prevent a Turkish ground offensive against these U.S.-backed Kurdish forces. And there are two conditions that Turkey wants in order to not launch a ground offensive from the United States, is what they're asking the United States. They're asking for the Kurds to pull back, I believe, something like 30 kilometers from the border. So they're asking for those Kurdish forces to pull back, which I believe the U.S. has agreed to. This is what I've been getting. And they're asking for one other thing, which the U.S. does not seem to agree with just yet, and that is the extradition of PKK leaders and higher ups and stuff like this. Very much in line with what the Turks want from Finland and Sweden with regard to entering NATO. So that's kind of where we are at the moment.
That's it. Yes.
How do you see things?
I think you're absolutely right. And I'm going to say a few things first of all here. I don't know that the Russians have exactly green-lighted a Turkish offensive, because I don't know that they're in a position either to give a green light or a red light. I think this is a misunderstanding. But certainly they've had discussions with the Turks about this. We know that the Turkish defense minister has had discussions with Shoigu, who is the Russian defense minister. And there's been multiple talks, and of course Putin and Erdogan have had telephone conversations. So I'm sure that there's been discussions about this. And the rumours that are circulating is that the Russians are once again trying to set up a meeting between Erdogan and Assad. And Erdogan has basically said that he wants to meet Assad. And the possible venue for this meeting, by the way, would be Kazakhstan. And perhaps not coincidentally, the president of Kazakhstan, who's now just won an election, the president Tokayev, is now in Moscow, and he's having a meeting with Putin. So the Russians want to achieve some kind of reconciliation between the Turks and the Syrians, because that's important to try to bring the overall conflict in Syria to an end. Now, a couple of days ago, I also saw a report that, in fact, it was the Russians who first floated this idea and suggested it to the Kurds that if they really want to avert a Turkish ground invasion, and Erdogan has now talked about the fact that there will be a Turkish ground invasion unless he gets serious concessions, that the Russians told the Kurds, if you want to avert it, you ought to pull back 30 kilometers from the Turkish border. And the Kurds have apparently resisted that idea. The Americans have now accepted it. It was passed on to them by the Turks. The Americans are now trying to get the Kurds to agree. The United States does not want to see a Turkish invasion of northern Syria. It does not want to see its Kurdish proxies, because that's unfortunately what the Kurds have allowed themselves to become. It doesn't want them to be hammered in that kind of way. It's also unhappy not just about the extradition of the PKK and all those people to Turkey, and it's very difficult to see, by the way, how the United States could agree with that. If it were to agree to that, I think its relationship with the Kurds would probably break down. But apparently, Erdogan is saying, well, the other thing I want is I want my cut from any revenues you're getting from the oil you're extracting from eastern Syria. And apparently the US isn't keen on that either. So it's a complicated haggle. Erdogan, who's got an election to win in Turkey fairly soon, by the way, he's rising in the polls, but he's again playing hardball. He's negotiating, he's bargaining with the Russians, he's bargaining with the US. Personally, I think that he is going to launch some kind of a ground offensive in northern Syria, because I think that's what he wants to do. I think he feels that that's his way of getting back into the Syrian game, achieving this rapprochement with Assad, knocking the Kurds, but also by establishing a Turkish presence, getting some kind of influence in Damascus. So I think that's probably what's going to happen. And if I'm right, then the big losers are going to be the Kurds themselves, who've managed to lose the support of the Russians, who have antagonized the government in Damascus, who are, of course, going to be hammered by the Turks, but also the United States, which is going to see its position in eastern Syria severely weakened.
There's something like 900 American troops in Syria at the moment. What happens if Turkey does launch a ground offensive? I mean, this is so interesting. It's a NATO country launching an offensive against a NATO proxy, with another NATO country illegally occupying that a part of that territory.
Well,
what can
I
you
don't
say?
know.
I mean,
What can one say? I mean, I'm going to say straight away. I mean, my own personal view. I mean, Donald Trump, as president, wanted to pull those troops out. He made repeated efforts to do that. He was repeatedly blocked from doing it. The neocons in the Defense Department and in the State Department always managed to get the media worked up. The Democrats got the media worked up. They always found ways of blocking Donald Trump from pulling those troops out. I think what we see yet again is that his instincts on this were absolutely correct. The position of those 900 troops, if it is 900, some people think it's more than that, is ultimately unsustainable. They are isolated in this strip of eastern Syria. They've been overcommitted to supporting the Kurds. That has antagonized the Syrian government, the Turkish government, the Iraqi government, the Iranian government, the Russians. Everybody's unhappy about their presence. It's been a disaster for the Kurds themselves, because the Kurds have overcommitted to the US. And of course, I think sooner or later, especially if there is a Turkish invasion, those US troops will have to be pulled out.
is it too late for the Kurds to reconcile with Assad?
The great problem is that by now Assad doesn't trust them. And repeatedly it's been suggested to the Kurds, both by the government in Damascus and by the Russians, that their priority should be to get some kind of deal done, that they should come and sit down to a deal with each other. But the Kurdish leadership has repeatedly spoken about Assad as being their greatest enemy. That the Syrian government is their greatest enemy. And as a result, they've stuck by this alliance with the US, even though it's brought them nothing but trouble.
They're going to be the big losers then in all this, because the
Absolutely.
only way out for the Kurds is reconciliation with Assad. Outside of that,
Absolutely.
there is no way out, because I don't think the U.S. is going to give Erdogan everything he's asking. I think Erdogan knows that. That's why he's asking for so much.
Exactly. I think that's entirely right. I mean, I think that
Yeah.
one of the reasons why Erdogan is asking for all of those things is because he wants to carry out his ground offensive. And he's pitching his demands at a level which he knows the US will never agree to. And apparently there was a report earlier today, we're talking on the 28th of November, just to say, that he's now said that, everything is now ready for this offensive to be launched. And by the way, that suggests to me that it's been in preparation for some time. Either this is something that has just happened in response to that incident in Istanbul, that terrorist incident in Istanbul. But I mean, clearly, that's what Erdogan wants to do. He wants to meet with Assad. He wants, I suspect, some kind of deal with Assad, whereby Assad regains nominal control over eastern and northern Syria, the Kurdish regions, but some kind of important influence is achieved by Turkey in Damascus, and perhaps Turkey also will draw Syria closer into its own orbit alongside Russia. So I think this is what's going to happen. I think this is what Erdogan wants. And I think, as you correctly said, the Kurds have overplayed disastrously. And I think the United States has once again tried to pursue these overcomplicated strategies in the Middle East, as well, that it does everywhere. The neocons always have these overcomplicated strategies. They, in effect, try to partition Syria. And what they've done is that the people they've used, in this case, the Kurds, have been led to disaster. Apparently, the Russians, I say apparently because obviously I'm not directly briefed by all of this, but apparently the Russians repeatedly warned the Kurds that this is what would happen. The Kurds refused to listen, and now we see where they are.
Right. Turkey kicks out the Kurds from where they are. They have some leverage as they sit down with Damascus, which will be a historic meeting. It will signify the end of a very long conflict. Erdogan sits down with Assad, and Erdogan is asking for influence, more influence in Damascus. And that's going to be the deal that they broker with Russia at the table as well. And what is that influence? What does that really mean?
Yeah, I mean, is
it resources, money, oil, gas pipelines? What exactly is Erdogan's real play here with regards to Turkey and influence over Damascus? Because, okay, influence in Damascus, that's fine, but what are we really talking about?
It is all of those things. Above all, it is Turkish economic penetration into Syria. So, I mean, the Russians will continue to exercise considerable influence in Syria because they will have their base there. They will remain the guarantors of Syria. The Iranians will still have some kind of a presence in Syria. But economically, the Turks will want to penetrate Syria. And I'm not going to say that Syria is going to become an economic satellite of Turkey, but I mean, probably that's what some people in Ankara are thinking.
No, but it does. It's interesting because at a point in time, say 4 or 5 years ago, Turkey was completely out of the mix with regards to Syria. They were going to gain nothing out of all their their adventures. Let's just call them that, to their adventures in Syria, because Turkey was on the side of Assad must go. They were on the side of the U.S. and so many other countries involved in trying to overthrow Assad. So they were on that side, and they were going to get zero out of Assad's victory in this conflict. But interestingly enough, they've managed to now put themselves in a position where they are going to get something out of this, and it's going to be something, economic, but it's something. They went from nothing, from being on the losing side, to now being in a position to gain something. And it's also going to do another thing. If Turkey now gets to sit at the table, they're going to be sitting at the table with Russia, with Iran. And once again, you're strengthening as guarantors in a way. You're strengthening the relationship between these three powers as well, because they're all now invested in Syria in one form or another.
That's exactly correct. That's entirely right. Now, can I just say, I mean, Erdogan is more keen at the moment to meet Assad than Assad is to meet Erdogan, because Assad clearly doesn't want to be in a situation where the Turks have achieved this kind of influence over Syria. But he may have to. He may have no choice. And Erdogan has just issued, made comments about, that we can have this reconciliation with the Syrians, just as we've achieved a similar reconciliation with Egypt. So he's talking about a reconciliation with Syria, but one from which, as I said, Turkey will achieve a great deal. Now, you're quite right. The Turks, it looked at times after 2015, when the Russians intervened, they were going to be the big losers. They were able to pull it back because they maintained their dialogue with the Russians. And the Russians needed the Turks to help them stabilize Syria and bring the war there under control. So you had this very difficult, but it never broke down. There was always this dialogue between Putin and Erdogan, and they were able to sort of each get their own things. So the Russians got Turkish help to stabilize Syria. The Turks got Russian help, ultimately, to get themselves back into the Syrian game. Each has got what they wanted from the other. The Syrians, at least they've survived. Their state has survived. Their economy will be rebuilt in one form or another. Maybe the Turks will be more visible on the ground than they would perhaps altogether like, but there we go. Iran will remain a major player because, of course, it's been an emotional and economic and military and intelligence backer of the Syrian government. The big loser is going to be the United States.
The Kurds.
And the Kurds. And the Kurds. So the Russians, the Syrians, and the Iranians, and the Turks all do diplomacy. The United States never did diplomacy over the Syrian conflict. And now it runs the real risk of being frozen out.
All right. The Duran.locals.com. Go to Duran Shop, 10% off. Use the code GOOD DAY. And we are also on Rockfin as well. Take care.